With more self-control, we could all eat right, exercise regularly, avoid temptations, stop procrastinating, and achieve all sorts of goals. But according to the American Psychological Association, the number one reason for not following through with such changes is a lack of willpower. So in order to achieve our goals, we need to understand why we lack willpower and what we can do to strengthen them. So as I was looking up some research, I found 4 main reasons as to why we lack willpower. Number 1 is overuse. So I want you to think of willpower like your muscles. If you overwork them and you don't give them time to rest and recover and rebuild, well, you're simply not going to be able to use them. They're not going to be there when you need them. So you need to do the same with your willpower. Number 2 is glucose. Again, I want you to think of your willpower just like your muscles. Your muscles need protein to rebuild, and your willpower needs glucose to rebuild. Glucose is your willpower's protein. Now, number 3 is mood. I make some of my worst decisions when I'm in a bad mood. And this is usually when most of us miss out, is when we're in a bad mood, when we're overwhelmed, when we're stressed out. That's when we make a bad judgment. That's when we give in to temptations. So ideally, you'd like to avoid making tough, challenging decisions when you're in a bad mood. But life isn't perfect, and that's not always the answer. Sometimes we need to make those tough decisions and stick through with our goals, even when we're in a bad mood. So later on, I'll give you a tip on what you can do for when you're faced with those challenges and you're in a bad mood. But moving on to the last reason, number 4, is beliefs. Now this one's a little contradictory because the other 3 were predicated on the idea that willpower is a resource that can be depleted. But colleagues found that individuals who thought willpower was a limited resource were subject to having their willpower depleted. But people who did not believe willpower was easily exhaustible showed no signs of depletion. So that's important because we're going to come back to that later and reevaluate that. But let's move on to 5 tips to strengthen your willpower first. The first one is to avoid temptations, right? This is the most obvious one. To give you an example, if you want to avoid drinking alcohol, let's say, just don't go to the bar. It's much easier to avoid going to the bar than it is to go to the bar and avoid ordering drink after drink after drink. Number 2 is to apply an if-then statement. This is what's going to come in handy for when I'm talking about you're in a bad mood. You want to negotiate with yourself beforehand, because most of the time it's like a devil on one shoulder, which is your emotions, and an angel on the other shoulder, which is your calm, cool rationality. Now, if you wait to negotiate when those emotions are high, they always win out. But if you apply an if-then statement, meaning when I'm creating my goal, if I'm faced with this possible temptation or this obstacle, then I'm going to do this. If you negotiate beforehand, then when those emotions rise up, you don't even give them the time of day to negotiate. You say, no, I already talked this one through, we're not doing it. If this happens, then I'm doing this no matter what. Now, number 3 is to have high motivation. This isn't something I can necessarily give to you guys, but this is a clue that if you don't feel high motivation towards a goal, well, number 1, you're probably not going to follow through and achieve it. But number 2, it's probably a sign that this goal isn't for you. And that's okay, because there is definitely a goal out there that's for you, and you need to find the one that's pulling you naturally to it. Number 4 is to exercise it regularly. Again, just like a muscle. Use it frequently, otherwise you'll lose it. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. And number 5 is to focus on one goal at a time, because multitasking is a myth. In order to achieve our goals, and if willpower truly is a limited resource, then we need to use it wisely. Now that's a lot to remember. I just gave you guys 5 tips on how to strengthen your willpower, 4 reasons on why your willpower can be depleted, and I don't expect you guys to remember all those or even be able to apply all those right after this. But we do want to learn what we can do in order to achieve our goals, otherwise this would be a waste here. So we need to find out which are the few that are the most important that we can apply to our goals. Where can we apply the 80-20 rule to this? So in order to find that out, I'm going to share with you a story that's ultimately going to answer that question. Now, how many of you have heard of or seen the movie Lone Survivor with Mark Wahlberg, or at least heard of this story? Okay, so Lone Survivor, for those of you who don't know, based on a true story, was a mission of Navy SEALs. I believe it was SEAL Team 3 that went out on a mission, and all of them, unfortunately, ended up dying except for one in the movie. That was Mark Wahlberg. Now, David Goggins was friends with all those men on that mission, and after that, he felt very touched by it and started a foundation that would provide 100% tuition for children whose parents died overseas in combat. Now, in order to raise money, he decided to run the world's hardest race, 135 miles through Death Valley in the summertime. But before he can even qualify for that race, You have to be able to run 100 miles within 24 hours. Now, David Goggins is not well prepared for this. He's like the bodybuilder types, right? The ones that they're swole, but when it comes to cardio, that's not their forte. He's maybe ran 10 miles all year round, so he's not well prepared for this. But 4 days later, he's competing in the San Diego One Day, a 24-hour 1 mile track. So you run around this 1 mile track for 24 hours and see how many laps you can get. And his goal is 100 miles. So he comes out there very well prepared, brings a lawn chair, box of crackers, and that's it. Didn't even bring any water with him. And around mile 30, he starts to develop shin splints and stress fractures, but he keeps on going. Then around mile 50, he starts to feel the metatarsals in his feet slowly break, but he keeps on going. Then around mile 70, he is totally destroyed. He sits down in his lawn chair and he literally cannot stand up. It's so bad he even went to the bathroom on himself. He literally could not stand up. But all he could think about was how he was going to get back up and finish that race. Then about an hour goes by, he gets some water in him, his crew's trying to revive him, and later on he's able to stand back up, and then shortly after that, he's back to running. Running 31-minute miles. We can probably walk faster than that. And around mile 81, his crew tells him he's not going to be able to make the time. This is when most of us would probably think, we've gave it all we got, this is it. But he was not going to give up, and this is when his body really realized that. When his mind said, oh, even if I'm not going to make the time, I'm still going. And this is when his body, instead of normally, right, our body tries to fight us and say, stop, look, you're hurting me, put me down. And your mind say, no, but I want to keep going for this goal. Well, his body realized that that wasn't an option. So his body said, you know what, instead of fighting you, I'm going to use all the rest of my energy and resources to help you get through this race. And that's when he said his mind, body, and spirit literally became one, and he ended up running 101 miles in 18 hours and 56 minutes. So what did we learn from that story? Well, the most important thing here is clearly to me belief. Nowhere in there do we see that belief wasn't an option. He had to believe in himself. And in fact, the Navy SEALs use a 40% rule that when you feel like you've reached your limit and you can't go any further, that you're actually only 40% through of your capabilities, and you have a lot more to go in reserves. So you have to believe that you have more than you think you do and keep pushing through. And even the research showed this too when the colleagues looked into this. Number 2 is to have those if-then statements ready. If he didn't do that, if he didn't tell himself, if I face the worst possible scenario, if I'm faced with the worst I ever feel in my entire life, then I'm going to keep going. Now mind you, he said at mile 70, this is the worst he has ever felt in his entire life. And this is a guy who has been through 3 Navy SEAL Hell Weeks and Ranger School. And this is the worst he's felt in his life. You have to have those if-then statements ready. And then lastly, you gotta have that high motivation. You have to have something pulling you towards your goal. Now, if you can apply those 3 things, just focus on those 3 and sprinkle the rest in when you're ready, you will be able to achieve your goals. Thank you.